I look at that with a clinician's eye is that you have narcissistic mothers in particular who are dramatically portraying their creative openness and their compassion by exposing their children to adult males who are autogynephilic, who are dressed up in lingerie, who are dancing seductively in front of them as a display of the mother's moral virtue.
Woo! Jordan Peterson. God love you, Jordan Peterson. Keep it up. Keep up the good work. So he is interviewing Sara Stockton, and this lady has been in the therapy arena of gender transition for 15 years. And she was at the very cusp of the transition, no pun intended, of adults transitioning to children transitioning. And Jordan Peterson has a fascinating conversation with her. So please watch the whole thing. It's really long. It's about an hour and a half. But I'm just going to give you some highlights, and please watch it till the end. The stuff at the end is some of the best stuff. So let's see what they have to say.
What at this time they were really recognizing was would there be a better outcome for these individuals if there was early intervention medically. Therefore, the responsibility of my group was to take the original assessment that was used for adults and turn it into a comprehensive assessment to evaluate child's readiness along with their family, because this was a systemic program, to see if they understood the implications of starting hormone blockers or hormone replacement surgery. I will say when we started doing this, it wasn't a lot of children. There wasn't like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds like there are now that need to be seen. These were children, like you said, that were presenting pretty young with aversions to their body, right? And these are, at this time too, we don't have internet. We don't have internet in the same capacity, TikTok, right? They don't know what they're talking about. So they're not telling us I'm transgender. These were parents bringing kids to us saying something's going on. And one of the biggest areas and domains that are no longer discussed, and this is where developmentally I was really concerned, is future expectations. I mean, when I was doing it back then, these children understood they were never going to be that gender. So if they were going to be a trans male. And I think that distinction was significant. Whereas now it is magical. Like, no, I'll be a male because I said it. And one of the things that I can't assess as easily is, do they know the implications to what they're doing?
Okay, so she was involved in the very first stages of, they were treating adults, and they thought, well, maybe it would be better if we caught kids earlier than adults. It would be easier to transition. You can kind of see a thought process in there that kind of makes sense. But she describes here a very different situation than the situation we have now. You have kids coming into therapy that don't know what's going on, but they know that there's something wrong. And contrast that with today, where we are literally telling kids, if you want to be a girl, you can. And if you want to be a boy, you can.
And you said that when you were educated, that all of this was collapsed into something that's like a hyper oversimplification. Right, and then there's a moralistic element to it too. I mean, Zucker's a really good example, because Ken Zucker was probably the world's foremost leading authority on gender dysphoria and autogynephilia, which he separated very carefully clinically. He ran the gender dysphoria clinic in Toronto and was eventually hounded out of his life by gender-affirming activists. And what Zucker showed were well, apart from the distinction between the autogynephilic types and then the kids who had cross-sex temperament, he showed that if you left kids who had body dysmorphia issues alone, 90% of them would settle into their biological identity by the time they were 18 or 19. But he also showed quite clearly that the early onset gender dysphoria kids were much more likely to be gay, about 80% of them. These people that you were seeing in their early middle age, do you think that what proportion of them do you think were temperamentally ill-fitted, let's say, to their biological sex, masculine girls or feminine boys? And how many of them do you think at that time, this is back in 2008, fit more into the autogynephilic category?
So and this is one of the reasons, Dr. Peterson, why I'm having this conversation with you. I have to be honest, being taught under this terminology, it wasn't until I was in my practice on my own for many years that I was even introduced to the terminology autogynephilia, and that I was not taught.
Yeah, well, so that's very much worth delving into. I mean, there's a very cardinal temptation for people who are wading into extremely complex territory to assume that the territory is a lot simpler than they think, to assume the problem is unidimensional, and then worse, to assume that the treatment is simple and unidimensional.
Let's just pull out some of those points. One of those points is what I have mentioned many, many times in the past. And that is, if you leave kids alone, most of them, when they get to be adults, will end up being just normal, everyday gay people. So you don't want to interfere in that process and make a boy into a girl if he was just supposed to be a gay man. And the second part of this is what the intelligentsia will not let us discuss. There is a section of the population, the male population, who is turned on by dressing up as women. We have known this for centuries, millennia, forever. Okay? So we can't all of a sudden pretend that these people do not exist. And here is a person who has been in the field for 15 years, and she did not know that this particular proclivity existed. And she's in the field of trans, and she did not know that there was a sexual element to men dressing as women. That means that we have a serious problem in the field of psychology. If they are not being taught this, how can you treat someone if you don't even know it's an option? And number two, if you are told that kids can change their gender at any time, you are going to push kids to change gender when that's probably not the best course of action.
One of the things that really surprised me in life was when I met my first detransitioner. And one of the things that was really surprising about that was when they were my client originally, they had no gender dysphoria. They had no body dysphoria. They moved away to California and they were gay. And they transitioned and fully facial reconstruction. I came back and I didn't recognize them. And they said they made a mistake. And I was like, how did this happen? I worked with you 3 years. I never heard you discuss body. And it's an option, like you said, about modern day conversion therapy, that it would be probably just easier if I was female instead of being gay. And they transitioned and they made a mistake. And that was my first wow, this is happening to people who didn't even have body dysphoria.
And the notion that it's also very interesting to speculate about why the delusion that puberty blockers, hormone treatment, and then surgery is going to be an easier route forward. The idea that people take that for granted is also an indication of stunning diagnostic and assessment insufficiency. It's a miracle of a negative sort that we've actually got ourselves in a situation where this is not only the standard of care, but it's the mandated standard of care, because across jurisdictions across the Western world, increasingly, if you're a therapist and you don't affirm someone's identity, which could certainly mean within the first 3 sessions, then you're actually on the hook for professional malpractice. But nonetheless, jurisdictions all around the world rushed in to show their, what would you call, ethical superiority on the woke front, and mandated therapists adopt this gender-affirming stance.
So this is where this gets super scary. So she was treating a gay person who had problems. They moved away, and they moved to a state, California, that believes in gender-affirming care. Not only believes in gender-affirming care, mandates gender-affirming care. So what is gender-affirming care? That's not therapy. It's not therapy. Because what a therapist is supposed to do is probe your own assumptions. I'm afraid of spiders. If I walked into a therapist office and I said, I'm afraid of spiders, and a therapist looked at me and said, yes, you should be afraid of spiders, he's not a very good therapist. And he'd probably get his license taken away. But in California, with a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 15-year-old, you can't even question them. It is mandated. You could have your license removed. Imagine the fallout in 5 years, 10 years of all these lost kids, all these kids who were led astray, all these kids who watched TikTok and thought, oh, trans is so much fun. It's going to be so easy. I can just be a girl. It's a catastrophe.
To be informed and to give ethical treatment and do no harm. It wasn't until I was about 10 years in that a parent came and handed me a piece of paper and said, the medication that you want to give your children, my child is not FDA approved. Explain to me why I should give my child an non-FDA approved drug. These hormone blockers for children are still not FDA approved. I didn't know that, Jordan. One of the things I come across in my child, he's 10, and he came home and he was explaining to me about his friend who transitioned and is now a female. And first of all, he had a lot of questions for me because he was going to school with that child for many years. So his first question, of course, was, did this child grow a vagina over the summer?
Couldn't possibly disorient children more. There isn't anything you could possibly do to children. I don't think that confusing them about the difference between up and down would be more disorienting than confusing them about the difference between male and female. So delusional that it's almost, it's surreal. It's beyond surreal. It's surreal to the point of incomprehensibility. And there's an arrogance about it that is Luciferian in its magnitude. The idea that we can subvert the entire natural order to the subjective whim of children is absolutely preposterous. And so, okay, so now we're letting kids, no, we're mandated to encourage children to assume that they're only what they are as a consequence of their day-to-day subjective self-evaluation, right? And there's nothing stable about that either, because the additional claim is not only are you only who you say you are or feel you are, whatever the hell feel means, but that can switch at your choice at any moment, and no one has anything to say about that as well, under threat of punishment of law. And then we think, well, are we confusing children? It's like, well, not only are they being confused as a consequence of that, we're setting out to confuse them as deeply as we possibly could.
The subjective will of children that could change at any moment. On the threat of the authority of the law. He puts it into pretty stark terms. And the beginning of this, she did not know that puberty blockers are not FDA approved for children. We have no tests. have no long-term studies. This stuff is super scary. Super scary. Now, here's the best part. Here is the best part. He's going to take narcissism, greed, vanity, and social credit and wrap it all into a bow describing how we got here.
And I'm certainly not saying that all surgeons are sadistic, but I am saying if you are sadistic and you have a medical bent, then surgery is a perfectly lovely place to end up. And I can't help but wonder in my darker moments just how much underground pleasure the butchers are taking in precisely their butchery. And so, people might think, well, do we really have to go there? And the answer is, well, when you're starting to strip the forearm musculature off 15-year-olds to build them a penis that will never work, and you're charging them $500,000 to do that over their lifetime, and you're putting them on the medical mill, and you're funding your goddamn hospital not in least as a consequence of these surgical procedures, then yes, we have to go there. If you don't think greed is driving this kind of narrow greed allied with a kind of sadism, then you're not thinking. The other thing that's happening too, and you can comment on this maybe as a clinician, is that, when you make a cataclysmic decision in your life, like you're male and you think, I'm female, and then you go and do what's necessary to transform yourself into an ersatz female, there's going to be a big part of you that has some major doubts, and that's never going to go away. And you could deal with those doubts honestly and accept it as a cost of your decision, or you could do this. You could decide to go out and beat the drum about just how right you were. And you could push that all the way to the point where you're now convincing children that it would be in their best interest to do exactly what you did. Well, not only are we like this, but everyone should be like this, including children. And I also see that kind of insanely narcissistic psychopathology emerging on the drag queen story hour front. Because what I see when I look at that with a clinician's eye is that you have narcissistic mothers in particular who are dramatically portraying their creative openness and their compassion by exposing their children to adult males who are autogynephilic, who are dressed up in lingerie, who are dancing seductively in front of them as a display of the mother's moral virtue. Did your instructors ever talk to you about Munchausen syndrome or Munchausen by proxy?
No. And I had to come across that later in my practice, which is really that was kind of the final case where I saw in front of me a mother really present this for her child. First of all, a parent presenting the case was a very unique situation of this is how it's happened, this is how my kid presented, and the kid not being able to articulate the same story, but going along with it. And so for a kid, I saw him being taught what was happening to him instead of it was already happening to him. And this was a very wild case, and where I suggested to hold back and wait on giving them hormones, and the courts overrode what I said, and the doctors went ahead, even though I suggested to hold. And that father lost his rights and ultimately did take his life.
Here's the terrible Oedipal situation. So imagine that you have a mother who's very immature and narcissistic, right? Then she has a child who manifests some forms of misbehavior, as all children do, but maybe a little bit more extreme, And then the woman is casting about for reasons why her relationship with her child is disturbed, which is causing her suffering. Well, especially if she's narcissistic and immature, the easy route out of that is to assume that there's something fundamentally wrong with the child. Okay, now then you ally that with the narcissistic desire for unwarranted status, and the mother learns very rapidly that if her child is trans, that that's pretty damn trendy and cool. And she can get a reputation among her local community for being incredibly progressive and compassionate and caring. And she can shine in her virtue. So I'll give you an example of this. When Ron DeSantis went after Disney, one of the Disney executives, there was a video that was released where a number of Disney executives were talking about their efforts to push the LGBT plus agenda using the Disney entertainment apparatus. And this woman, who, if I remember correctly, was in charge of domestic programming for Disney. And she said in the video that she had a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, and one of them was trans, and the other was pansexual. Okay, and so then I did a quick statistical calculation. Okay, so the probability that as a given mother, that you would have a trans child, truly trans, by the definitions of 20 years ago, is 1 in 3,000 approximately. And the probability that you'd have a pansexual child, whatever the hell that is, because that only emerged like 3 years ago, is obviously less than 1 in 3,000. But let's call it 1 in 3,000. Okay. The joint probability that you would have a trans child and a pansexual child is 1 in 9 million. And so what that means diagnostically is if you were evaluating that woman and her children, you would have a 2,999,999 to 1 probability that you were accurate if you diagnosed her as narcissistic.
Mic drop. Mic drop. That's it. Jordan said it all. That is why we were at this place. It's a combination of people trying to be nice, women feeling for the children and not wanting to be left out, greed, narcissism, social credit, all wrapped into a big bow. Way to go, Jordan. You're awesome. Everybody, please like, comment, subscribe, share this out to people. It helps me out a lot. We'll see you on the next one.